Good evening and welcome back. Before we begin, if you're new here, consider subscribing because on this channel, we don't just follow events, we try to understand the system behind them. And today, something important happened. The negotiations have collapsed. J.D. Vance has returned to the United States. The Iranian delegation has also stepped back. The talks in Islamabad are over, for now. And if you've been following this channel, you already know this is not surprising. Because in the last video, we said something very clearly. These negotiations were unlikely to succeed. Not because diplomacy is impossible, but because the system was not ready for an agreement. And today, that prediction has played out. But here's the real question. Now that negotiations have collapsed, what actually happens next? Does this move us closer to war? Or does it reveal something deeper about how modern conflicts really work? Because what comes after collapse is often more important than the talks themselves. If we begin from this moment, the confirmed collapse of negotiations, the first instinct is to interpret it as failure, a breakdown, an inability to reach agreement, a missed opportunity for de-escalation. And at the surface level, that is true. The talks did not produce a deal. Both sides stepped away. Positions remained unresolved. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper pattern. Because in geopolitics, negotiations rarely fail suddenly. They fail structurally. They fail because the conditions required for agreement do not exist. And when those conditions are absent, talks are not designed to succeed. They are designed to test limits, to measure pressure, to explore how far each side can move without losing position. So the collapse we are seeing is not simply the end of a process. It is the outcome of a system that was never aligned for resolution in the first place. To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning of the talks. Not the moment they started, but the conditions that made them necessary. Because these negotiations did not emerge from stability. They emerged from pressure. Escalation had been increasing. Signals were intensifying. Deadlines were becoming more frequent. Each side was trying to shape the trajectory, to create leverage, to force movement. And this kind of environment produces a very specific type of negotiation. Not cooperative, but constrained. Because when talks begin under pressure, they are not about finding common ground. They are about managing risk. Each side enters with a clear objective: maintain position while avoiding escalation that becomes uncontrollable. This creates a narrow space, a space where movement is limited, where concessions are risky, and where trust is minimal. Now consider how each side approached this situation. For the United States, represented by figures like J.D. Vance, the goal was to translate pressure into outcome. Economic pressure, military signaling, strategic messaging, all designed to bring Iran to the table with reduced leverage. But there is a limitation to this approach. Pressure works, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, it stops producing compliance and begins producing resistance. Because the opposing side adapts. It absorbs pressure. It adjusts strategy. And it looks for ways to regain balance. Iran, in this case, did not respond with immediate escalation. It responded with patience, with delay, with controlled engagement. And this matters, because when one side accelerates and the other slows down, the structure of the interaction changes. The faster side begins to lose control of tempo. It must wait for responses, interpret delays, adjust expectations, and over time, this reduces its ability to dictate the pace. So while it may appear that pressure was increasing, control was not necessarily increasing with it. This is one of the first structural tensions that shaped the outcome. Now we introduce another layer, the regional system. Iran does not operate in isolation. Its strategic posture is connected to multiple actors across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. These are not separate conflicts. They are part of a network. And this network creates a multiplier effect. Any escalation involving Iran has the potential to expand across multiple fronts, across multiple actors, and across multiple timelines. This changes the nature of negotiation, because the stakes are no longer bilateral, they become regional. And when stakes expand, so does risk. This makes agreement more difficult, because each side must consider not only the direct consequences, but the indirect ones as well. Now we turn to another critical constraint: energy. The global system is deeply dependent on stable energy flows, and one of the most sensitive points in that system is the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the world's oil passes through it, and Iran has the ability to disrupt that flow. Not completely, but enough to create instability. And instability in energy markets produces immediate consequences. Prices rise. Markets react. Economic pressure spreads globally. This introduces a powerful constraint, because escalation is no longer just a military decision. It becomes becomes an economic one. And economic systems react faster than political systems. They anticipate risk, they price it in, and they create feedback. Feedback that decision makers cannot ignore. So even as negotiations were taking place, this layer of pressure was present, quietly influencing the boundaries of what was possible. Now consider military reality. There is often an assumption that escalation can be controlled through precision. That limited action can produce limited outcomes. But this depends on the nature of the target. And Iran presents a complex target. Its infrastructure is dispersed. Its facilities are hardened. Its strategy is asymmetric. This means there is no clean option, no guaranteed outcome. Any action introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty reduces control. So decision makers face a dilemma: continue pressure and risk unpredictable escalation, or pause and reassess. This is where the cost versus outcome imbalance becomes visible. The cost of escalation is clear, high, immediate, multi-dimensional, but the outcome is uncertain. No guaranteed resolution, no clear endpoint. And this imbalance makes agreement difficult, because both sides recognize the risks, but neither side wants to concede. This creates a deadlock, not because negotiation failed in a simple sense, but because the system could not produce a solution under those conditions. Now we add another layer: global pressure. Allies do not operate independently of risk. European states tend to favor stability. They interpret escalation as disruption, and they signal for restraint. Gulf states, despite their tensions with Iran, are directly exposed to regional instability. They also prefer controlled outcomes. And then there are global markets, reacting in real time, adjusting to risk, creating pressure that feeds back into decision-making. All of these forces were present during the negotiations, shaping the environment, limiting options, defining boundaries. So when we look at the collapse of talks, we must see it in this context. Not as a sudden failure, but as the natural outcome of a system under constraint. A system where pressure was high, risk was increasing, trust was low, and outcomes were uncertain. Under these conditions, agreement becomes extremely difficult, because moving forward requires accepting risk, and neither side was willing to do so. So the talks ended, not because diplomacy failed as an idea, but because the system could not support a deal at that moment. And that brings us to the most important insight. The collapse of negotiations is not the end of the process. It is the transition into the next phase. Because when talks fail under pressure, the system does not return to normal. It shifts back into escalation, but with higher stakes, less trust, and narrower options. And that is where the real story begins. Not in the collapse itself, but in what comes after. Because what happens next will not be random. It will follow the same structure, the same constraints, the same pressures, only now with less room for error. And that is why this moment matters. Because it is not just the end of negotiations, it is the beginning of something more uncertain and potentially more dangerous. And this is where the situation becomes more complex, not less. Because once negotiations collapse, the system doesn't reset. It tightens. The same pressures that made agreement impossible don't disappear. They remain in place, but now without the buffer of dialogue. And when that buffer is gone, everything becomes more sensitive. Signals carry more weight. Actions are interpreted more aggressively. And even small movements can create large reactions. So what we are entering now is not a phase of clarity. It is a phase of ambiguity. At first, it may look calm. No immediate strikes, no dramatic escalation, no clear turning point. But this calm is misleading. Because beneath it, both sides are adjusting, quietly, carefully, preparing for what comes next. For Donald Trump, the collapse of talks does not remove pressure. It changes how pressure is applied. During negotiations, pressure is partly restrained. Signals are balanced. Escalation is managed to keep talks alive. But once talks end, that restraint weakens. Now the objective shifts from reaching agreement to restoring leverage. And restoring leverage requires action. Not necessarily large actions, but visible ones. Statements become firmer. Red lines become clearer. Military presence becomes more noticeable. This is not escalation for its own sake. It is signaling, a way of communicating without returning immediately to the table. At the same time, Iran adjusts as well, but in a different way. Instead of accelerating, it often slows down even further. Responses become more calculated, more indirect, more difficult to interpret. And this creates a structural imbalance. One side moves to reassert pressure. The other moves to absorb and redirect it. And when these two approaches interact, the system becomes harder to read, because outcomes are no longer immediate. They are delayed, distributed across time and space. Now we begin to see the next layer, indirect escalation. Because direct confrontation carries too much risk, pressure often moves through other channels. Regional actors become more active. Incidents increase, but remain limited. Tensions rise, but do not cross into full conflict. This is what makes the situation feel unstable. Not because something dramatic is happening, but because many small things are happening at once. Each one manageable on its own, but collectively creating a sense of uncertainty. And uncertainty is what defines this phase. Now consider how the economic system responds. Unlike political decisions, which can be delayed, markets react instantly. They do not wait for confirmation. They respond to probability, to perceived risk. And when negotiations collapse, perceived risk increases. Oil prices begin to move. Shipping routes become more cautious. Insurance costs rise. All of this happens quickly, and it matters, because economic reactions feed back into strategic decisions. They create pressure, not through intention, but through consequence. And those consequences cannot be ignored. So even as political actors adjust their positions, the economic system is already shaping the environment in which they operate. Now we return to something more subtle, tempo. During escalation, tempo is often fast. Signals come quickly, responses follow. There is a sense of momentum, but after collapse, tempo becomes uneven. One side may accelerate, the other may delay, and this creates friction. Because when timing is not aligned, interpretation becomes difficult. Is a delayed response a sign of restraint or preparation? Is a rapid signal a sign of strength or pressure? These questions do not have immediate answers, and that uncertainty increases the risk of miscalculation. This is why the current phase is often the most dangerous, not because conflict is certain, but because clarity is absent. And without clarity, decision-making becomes more difficult. Now we must consider the role of allies, because they do not disappear after negotiations fail. If anything, their influence increases. European states begin to push more actively for de-escalation. Gulf countries become more cautious. They watch closely. They signal concern. Because they understand that the cost of escalation will not be evenly distributed. And this introduces another constraint, external pressure. Not direct control, but influence. Encouraging restraint, discouraging rapid escalation. And this influence shapes behavior, quietly, but consistently. At the same time, back-channel communication continues. Even when talks are declared over, communication rarely stops completely. Messages are still passed. Signals are still exchanged, not publicly, but through indirect channels. This is critical, because complete silence increases risk. And the system, even under pressure, tries to avoid that. So what we are seeing is not a breakdown of communication. It is a transformation of communication, from open dialogue to indirect signaling. Now we come to the broader pattern, because this is not a one-time event. It is part of a cycle. Escalation builds. Negotiation begins. Negotiation fails. Pressure returns. And then, eventually, negotiation resumes again. But each cycle is different. Each one starts from a slightly different position, with higher stakes, less trust, and narrower options. This is what makes each phase more sensitive than the last, because the margin for error decreases over time. Now we return to the central question that defines this entire situation. What happens after negotiations collapse? The simple answer is pressure returns. But the deeper answer is more complex. The system enters a phase where escalation is possible, but constrained. Communication continues, but indirectly. Risk increases, but remains managed. This is not stability, but it is not chaos either. It is something in between. A controlled instability.